Hi everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. If you've had a Dogman encounter of your own and would like to speak with me whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. Tonight's guest is Rick. Rick, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Vic.
Thanks for being here. Rick, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
Well, my name's Rick. I'm 52 years old. I'm married, have 2 children. I live in Central Florida. I'm a semi-retired now software engineer for Siemens. I'm former U.S. Army 82nd Airborne for 8 years, and that's pretty much it.
Thanks for your service to our country.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Rick, how much time did you spend in the woods before you had your encounter?
Oh, I grew up hunting, Vic. From the time I was old enough to carry a gun, I grew up deer hunting, squirrel hunting, rabbit hunting as a small child, and then advanced into the larger game as I got older. All my life, every chance I had to get into the woods to hunt, fish, camp, you name it, hiking, we were out there. And living in Florida and the weather's always good down here, we spend a lot of time out hiking and hunting and camping.
Well, it goes without saying you're definitely no stranger to the woods.
Oh, no, I spent probably most of my youth out in the woods, so, I was very, very familiar with them.
Sure sounds like it. What was your take on the existence of cryptids before that dogman came after you that day?
I never really had any interest in them. I heard of Bigfoot and stuff. I really didn't think anything about it. I didn't follow them. I'd never even heard of what a dogman was. I'd never heard of a dogman at all until I'd heard of your show. But I didn't follow that kind of stuff. I was more into the sports and music and stuff like that. I wasn't really interested in cryptids.
Well, that doesn't make you any different from most people. The Daniel Boone National Forest is where your encounter happened. What can you tell us about the park?
Well, it's a very large park in southeastern Kentucky. The Cumberland River actually runs through it. And the area where I was at, it's very densely forested, very rocky and hilly, coming off the Appalachian Mountains there. And it's got several river areas that run through it, but it's extremely thick and overgrown in most places.
Yeah, that is a big park. Your encounter is not the only dogman encounter I've heard of that happened in that park, by the way. Did you know that other encounters have happened there?
No, sir, I did not. That's the first I've heard of it. I did recently hear about some incidents in the Land Between the Lakes area over on the western side. But as far as Daniel Boone, I'd never heard of anyone else seeing anything there. But I'm not surprised. After what I saw, anything's possible.
Oh, I'd say so. Considering that the Daniel Boone is in Kentucky, why did you decide to go there, considering you lived in Florida at the time?
Well, it's kind of a long story. I actually had been invited there by my uncle because I had been put on a trial about a month earlier. And it was a murder trial. And after the trial, I was pretty depressed and everything. And so he happened to be down from Kentucky because he's from Lexington. He had been down visiting family with us down there, and he asked if I wanted to come up with him, and he was going on a fishing trip there off of what's called the Rock Castle River there in the Daniel Boone Forest. They like to go up there in early March before all the kayakers get out on the river because the Rock Castle is pretty famous for whitewater. And they like to get out there because the smallmouth bass is really good up there supposedly that time of year. At that time, I would jump at a chance to go fishing anyway. So I told him I'd join him, and that's how I wound up going up there.
Yeah, sounds to me like you needed a vacation.
Absolutely.
Before you tell us about your encounter, please tell us about the area of the park where you had it.
Okay, where we were at was, like I said, we were on what's called the Rock Castle River, which comes down from the north, and it eventually runs into the Cumberland River there. We were probably about 2 miles north of the Cumberland River on the Rock Castle, on an area where there's a high-tension power line that comes across. And we were on the east side of the Rock Castle, and the power line comes and crosses the Rock Castle and carries on. So they have the wooded area because it's very thick and hilly in there and rocky. And the area is cleared out for the power lines, and they have like a road that you can ride down on either side, what we call a rut road. It's like the two rut lane roads that you can get in the woods that drives along on each side for maintenance on the power lines. And where we were at, down by the river, there's like a bluff there where the river has washed out the rock. And we were parked, actually camped there on the top of the bluff. And then there's a trail that goes down to the river, and there's a bank there. And we were going to fish off the bank there where the power line comes across.
I see. All right, Rick, please tell us about your encounter. Give us every last detail that comes to mind.
Okay, well, I'm going to start, Vic, with how I wound up going up there in the first place. Because to me, that's part of the story. What had happened was, I'm an engineer, and at the time, I was doing software engineering installation for telephone systems all around the country, so I was rarely home. And because I'm rarely home, I didn't stay up with current events. And apparently, there was this young man from Owensboro, Kentucky, that had come down to Central Florida, down there where I live. And he had this vampire cult, and his name was Rod. I don't want to give his full name, but it was actually fairly famous trial. This young man led a bunch of high school children in a vampire cult. And he came down to this small town where I live and had recruited several of the high school kids there to be in his vampire cult, where they would literally drink each other's blood and initiate each other into this cult. But anyway, this one young girl that he had recruited into his club wanted to get away from home. She was a very young little girl. And she said she couldn't get away from her parents. So he apparently went in and he murdered the two parents with an accomplice of his in his cult there. They bludgeoned the parents to death and stole their vehicle and took off out of Florida where they were captured. When I got home, this had already gone down. I didn't know anything about it. So I wound up getting impaneled on the jury of the trial for this young man. And after having to witness all the brutality and these children that grew up in this small town that I grew up in that were into witchcraft and Satan worship and reading the Necronomicon book and following the spells in it and stuff like that, really had me upset. And I was just very, very surprised that this was going on in my hometown, my very small hometown. So my uncle, like I said, was down visiting our family at the time, and he had planned a fishing trip in Kentucky. And so he asked me if I'd like to go to kind of get my mind off things. And my wife thought it was a wonderful idea because she could tell how depressed I was. And so I decided, yeah, he said, we'll spend a week up there. We'll just take it easy and just forget about everything. And I thought it was a great idea. So I packed up my stuff and off we went to Kentucky. We got to the Daniel Boone National Forest. We actually went to his home in Lexington first, packed up some gear, and then he drove us in his truck. I followed him up in my car, and then he drove us in his truck out to this area, it took us over 6 hours to get to this area. It's very densely forested. It's way back. He said it's so far back they have to pump the sunlight in. But it's way, way back in the woods. There's really no civilization out there. I didn't see a home for half an hour. But anyway, we finally got there. It was almost dark by the time we got there. So we decided we would camp that night there on the bluff. And then in the morning, we would start carrying all our gear down to the shore there by the rock castle to start fishing. We both woke up about sunrise the next morning, and when we first got out of the truck, I noticed at the time it was very cold, but not windy. It was a crystal clear day. This is early March 1998. It was very bright and sunny, but it was pretty chilly out. But there wasn't a bird chirping. There was no noise whatsoever coming out of the woods. It was dead silent. So we started grabbing our gear, and you get this feeling like you're being watched. But from the years I spent in the military, that third eye wakes up, and you start feeling like you're being watched, and you start looking over your shoulder, but you don't really see anything. We kind of shook it off, and he and I started carrying our gear down to the shoreline of the rock castle. And we got some chairs down and some bait and stuff, and we had guns with us. We actually carried guns because there are supposedly bear in that area, although I've never seen any or heard of any in there. He said they're in there, so I actually had a sidearm, a 357 Magnum. He had a 44 Magnum. And I had a 30-06 rifle, and he had a 12-gauge shotgun. We carried all that down, and we were just get set up fishing. We heard something in the woods. It sounded like it was walking, but it was making quite a bit of noise. And it would snap limbs, and it sounded like it might be bipedal. We weren't quite sure. But, sorry, Vic, this thing, we kept looking over our shoulders, and we kept hearing leaves and twigs breaking behind us, limbs snapping, and like something was walking around behind us off to our left. And then just out of nowhere, this thing bounded out of the woods. It probably jumped 20 feet onto the shoreline looking right at us. Now, it was on all fours at the time when it bounded out, and it was looking at us, and I can't even describe. This thing was absolutely massive. It was huge, every bit of over 400 pounds, 400 to 500 pounds at least. It was huge. And I thought at first it was a bear, but in my mind, I was frozen. I couldn't move. And my uncle was standing behind me. I couldn't see him, and I didn't know what he was doing, but I knew I was frozen solid. I could not move. And then this thing began to stand up on its hind legs. And when it stood up, it made this, I can't describe this noise it made when it stood up. It's kind of like large knuckles cracking and air escaping at the same time. And this thing, it must have been 8 feet tall when it stood up. And it was solid jet black. Its fur actually looked well groomed. It was solid jet black. It had ears on the top of its head that were narrow, long, and pointed with tufts at the top, kind of like a bobcat has. It had a very large, broad head with a very long snout, but wide snout, and a mouthful of teeth like I've never seen on anything. And every single one of its teeth were sharp. And it was kind of hunched over, and I don't know if the hair around its shoulders and its back was thicker and longer, or if it was just standing up on its back or what, but it came down to some really broad cannonball type shoulders that looked human. And this thing had long arms. They were extremely muscular. It came down into hands that looked like massive raccoon hands or claws, and it had long nails on it. They reminded me of a raccoon, but just huge. And it had a very thick, broad body and chest that would put any bodybuilder to shame. And it went down to very powerful, strong legs in the thighs. And then the lower legs were like dogs' legs. They were hawks that bend backwards. And this thing kind of hunched over like it was going to pounce, and its ears laid back on its head. And it began to growl this growl that when it growled, your whole body just shook. I mean, you could feel it through your chest, and like I said, I was frozen. I could not move. And right at that time, I heard this incredible, loud boom over my head. And apparently my uncle had pulled his 44 and fired this thing over its head. And this thing did a backward somersault from where it was at in the air over into the woods and bolted out. And as soon as it did, he and I hauled tail up the bluff to the truck. We left there's maybe still stuff sitting there. I don't know. We left our chairs there. We just grabbed our guns and our poles and booked it back up the bluff got to the truck, just threw our guns in the back and took off. And we no more than took off, and that thing bounded out of the woods on the other side of the power line. And we were flying down this power line, hitting bumps and potholes, and stuff was flying out of the back of the truck. And this thing was right on our tail the entire time. And as soon as we hit the hard road, he floored it. And this thing stayed with this truck. I don't know how fast he was going, because I was physically getting sick from it. But it followed us. We had to be doing every bit of 60 miles an hour, and this thing was still with us on our rear quarter, the right rear quarter. And finally, it either tired or just got tired of chasing us and veered off and went back into the woods. And we didn't talk about it at all the way home. I got like I said, I got physically sick and had to vomit outside the truck. And I have never been so scared in my life, Vic. Like I said, I did 3 tours of combat and never had that kind of fear go through me, and had never froze in fear like that. Over and over, I thought in my mind, we got to the house. He got out of the truck. I got out. I threw my stuff in my car and I pointed it towards Florida, and I came straight home. I didn't even slow down. All I stopped for was gas. And all the way home, I thought about the irony is I left Florida to get away from vampires, only to run into werewolves in Kentucky. But anyways, that's pretty much what happened, Vic. That's my story.
When it came out of the woods, was it closer to you or your uncle?
It was pretty much even with us. It was down the bank. It was south of us. I wouldn't say more than 40 yards at the most. And my uncle, like I said, he was standing behind me, almost directly behind me. And it was the equal distance from both of us. It's just, I couldn't see him, and I was so angry when he fired that pistol. I did not want to, I honestly, with all the firearms we had, I don't think we could have touched it.
Who did it seem to focus on more?
Well, it looked like it was looking at me, but that could have just been me thinking that. I don't really know. You know, it just looked angry. It looked angry that we were there. I don't know if we came in during its feeding or if it had children nearby, although this was a male. I know that for sure. But honestly, I don't know.
Well, I think more than likely you two were just at the wrong place at the wrong time. Was there a particular physical feature it had that upset you most?
Other than the fact that this thing was huge, those hands, I've never seen an animal with hands like that except for a raccoon. And I've certainly never seen a dog or a wolf. Well, I thought it was a werewolf at the time. But this thing had hands. It had hands and arms. It didn't have paws. And it had a human-type torso on it with the same muscular build and everything like humans have. But I'd have to say probably the teeth were the most intimidating thing it had.
Yeah, I can understand that. Looking back, do any of the thoughts that were going through your head at the time when you were standing there looking at that Dogman strike you as being strange now?
No, I can't remember having any thoughts except get the heck out of here. I just wanted to get away, Vic. Like, it was the most frightening thing that's ever happened to me. I've never been so scared in my life.
Oh, I'm sure. Did you notice any foul scents when it came after you?
Absolutely. Yeah, I forgot to mention that. It had a horrible stink to it. It had a rotten, dead animal meat smell to it, like roadkill that had been sitting in the sun for 3 or 4 days. It was horrible, horrible. And I'll have nightmares and I'll smell that smell. And this is almost 20 years later. And I still think about it. And it was absolutely, I think that's part of the reason I got so sick was that rancid smell this thing had. If you see one of these things, it will leave an impression on you. I guarantee it, Vic. It's just an unbelievable sight. Like I said, it's just massively huge. This thing is, you grow up your whole life thinking one way, and thinking, your parents will tell you as you're growing up, monsters don't exist. Well, trust me, they do.
That they do. At least you know the truth about that now.
Yes.
Did you see if it had a tail?
Yes, it did. It wasn't a very long tail for the size of the animal. It was a fairly short, kind of fluffy type tail, probably about the length of his thigh, maybe. But yeah, it did have a tail.
Since it was a canine type Dogman, I expected it to, but just to be thorough, I thought I'd ask you about that. Did it seem to be more clumsy on 2 legs than it was on all 4s?
It did a somersault backwards into the woods off 2 legs, Vic. This thing was, I don't think it mattered if it was on 2 or 4 legs. This thing was so nimble and so quick, yet so big. I don't think even if we'd have thrown down on it with those guns, we could have got a shot off.
You're probably right. How tall do you think it was on all 4s?
Oh, goodness. Probably up to my shoulders high. It's probably a good 4.5, 5 feet tall at the back. It kind of stood at a slope, kind of like a hyena does, with its rear legs seeming shorter because its front arms seem longer. So between 4.5, 5 feet at the back.
Yeah, that is big. Please tell us more about what happened after you left the Daniel Boone, such as, did you call anyone on the way home to share that experience with them?
No, at the time, I didn't even talk about it. Like I say, I didn't have a phone with me. Of course, back then, cell phones weren't near as prevalent, but I didn't have a phone with me on the way, and I didn't really talk about it and not even my uncle, all the way up to his house with him. And then after I left and headed home, I didn't talk to anybody about it or say anything until I got home and talked to my wife.
When you finally did make it home, did you do anything in particular to try and deal with that experience?
Well, for weeks and weeks afterward, I had nightmares, and I had told my wife about it, and she was very supportive, and she believed me. She believed everything I was telling her. She knew I was upset, and she knows when I'm upset, and she knew that this really had traumatized me. And, I'm not ashamed to admit I was bawling my eyes out. And she fully understood. And I would wake up sometimes at night with her holding me, saying I was screaming at night and just pouring sweat. And like I said, I could smell that smell. It was weeks after that before the nightmares started going away. And I actually was able to deal with it. But I did a little research, trying to research werewolves, and I'd never done any kind of cryptid research in my life. And the internet wasn't much. There was some dial-up out there, but there wasn't much on it. And you couldn't really find anything out. This is 1998. And, there's not a whole lot of information. Now, I did find out some things a few hundred years ago in France and in Germany. And I had read about the Rougarou in Louisiana. But as far as werewolves, that was stuff that was in movies. These things didn't exist for real. Not that I thought. So I really didn't know who to talk to or who to go to about it. I mean, who do you go to and say, hey, I saw a real-life werewolf the other day? They're going to look at you like you flipped your nut.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. Like you just said, you spent almost 20 years thinking you were the only person in the world to have a Dogman encounter. How did it feel when you finally found out so many other people had seen them too?
Well, much as I hate to say it, Vic, it was a huge relief, actually. You think you're the only one out there that's ever seen this thing. And I had a million things going through my mind. I tried to convince myself over and over it wasn't what I saw, that I'd mistaken it for a bear. And had my uncle not been with me at the time, I probably would have been able to convince myself that I had seen something else, because you just don't believe these things exist. And so I'm sorry, it's very hard to concentrate on that, Vic. It's just thinking about it gets me so upset. But finding out that other people knew about it was a huge relief for me. And then it's only been recently I even heard Lord Dogman. A good friend of mine actually told me about the show. Now, I had told him about my encounter very recently, actually, and I've known him since the 70s. And he said, sounds like you saw a Dogman. And I didn't know what a Dogman was. And he told me about your show. and I guess they listen to it where he works. And I listened to a couple of shows. I said, that's exactly what I saw. So to find out that there are other people that I can converse with, that there are others who have been through what I've been through and seen what I've seen, is a huge relief. Although I wouldn't want anyone to ever have this experience, and I certainly don't understand anybody that wants to go out and look for these things.
That is pretty hard to understand. I agree. When you were in the 82nd Airborne, how did the fear you felt while in combat compare to what you felt that day when the Dogman was coming after you?
Okay, well, in combat, first off, training kicks in immediately. I was in combat 3 times. I was in Grenada, I went to Panama, and then I was in Desert Storm. Now, I was with the 325th PIR of the 82nd Airborne, what they call the Falcon Brigade, and you prepare daily, every single day for combat. That's your job, it's what you do. Not that it is frightening and not that, those bullets start going over your head. It's scary, but it's something you expect. When something like this jumps out and you've got no defense against it, none whatsoever, you can't defend against it. And it completely is against anything you believe, then that's a whole different situation. Like I said, I've never been that frightened where I've been frozen in fear. I could not move until that 44 Magnum went off over my head.
Even if you know something like that's coming, you're still never going to be prepared for it. Considering your expertise with firearms, how much gun do you think you would have needed that day to safely confront that Dogman?
I'd start with an M1A1 Abrams tank, I think. Honestly, Vic, I know we didn't have the firepower to take it down. And, I was carrying a 30-06 and a 357. He's carrying a 12 gauge with triple-aught buck and a 44 Magnum, and I wouldn't have tried to take it on with those.
Yeah, a lot of people have tried taking Dogmen down with more formidable weaponry than that and failed, so it's good you realize that. Please tell us about how you were before your encounter versus how you are now after it.
Well, like I said, I grew up hunting, fishing, camping, spent probably half my childhood in the woods. I come from a long family of hunters. Never thought about anything in the woods that was dangerous. I knew there were bears and stuff like that out there, but I had the firepower to take care of them. I don't go hunting or camping or fishing anymore. And I'll fish, but it'll be on a lake that's around the town. I won't go in the woods. I don't camp. I stay on the hard road and don't even drive in the woods.
You've already talked about expected side effects, but have you suffered any unexpected side effects because of that encounter?
Just how it changed my lifestyle. That's about the only unexpected is how much it changed my lifestyle, because of the fact that I absolutely do not spend any time in the woods. Whether it's alone or with a group of 10 people, it wouldn't matter for me, because 10 people aren't going to take this thing down.
Not only do I hate Dogmen, I really hate what they do to people. Here you've got a man who just loved spending time out in the woods. Now, because of that experience with that Dogman, you can't do what you used to love doing, so it really is such a shame.
Yeah, I think I ruined it for my children too, Vic, because growing up, I have a son who's now in college, studying to be an engineer, and he won't go anywhere near the woods because I've always told him, stay out of the woods. There's things in there you don't know about. I've never elaborated because I never talked to him about it. I've only talked to my wife about it, and then recently my friend. But, I've always warned him and my daughter, stay away from the woods. There's things out there you just don't know. And it absolutely wrecked any kind of enjoyment I have for the woods.
Yeah, that really is a shame. Do you think you might tell your kids about what happened to you that day eventually?
I do believe I will. I probably am going to talk to my son about it here pretty soon. I don't worry about him going into the woods. He won't go because I guess I've scared him out of them, but he's a city boy anyway. He lives in the city, and I doubt he'll do any camping or anything like that in the woods anyway because I had scared him off. But I do plan on talking to him about it soon because the show mainly, I've discovered that talking about it actually helps. And that's a wonderful thing, Vic. It's a very unique thing you've got going here. It really is a big relief to be able to talk about it. Because even after 20 years, I started having nightmares again about it as soon as I started talking about it, but it makes it so much easier. And then knowing that there are so many others out there who have had the same experience I had, and finding out how they're dealing with it and sharing those experiences with each other, and knowing that you're not the only one out there and that you're not crazy. And I think a big part of it is being able to talk to somebody about it. Because like I said before, you couldn't tell anybody. If I'd have said 1998, if I'd have told somebody that I saw a werewolf, they'd have looked at me like I was crazy.
Oh, sure they would have.
And your show is very unique in that it actually allows people to talk about their experience and let others hear their experience and share their experience and know that you're not the only one out there and know you're not crazy. These things really do exist.
Misery does love company, and when you find out that so many other people out there have gone through the exact same thing that you went through, it does help a lot. Now that you've seen one, what do you think dogmen are?
Well, when I first saw it, a million things went through my mind, from trying to pawn it off as something else, and try to convince myself that I didn't see what I saw. Because it was broad daylight. There was no full moon out. So you think werewolf, but that's not when they're supposed to be out. And you think, well, is this some kind of mutated wolf? Is this some kind of mutated bear? This was around the Dolly the sheep time when they cloned the sheep. You think that some government agency do some kind of crazy genetic experiment and create these things? You don't know what it is. So finding out that these are actually living, breathing animals that exist out there, but they're very secretive. And for some reason, our government doesn't want to acknowledge they exist, but they do exist. And knowing they're real, flesh and blood, they're not really supernatural that I could tell. And most people say that they're just living, breathing animals that are out there. We just don't see them that much. Someone had said one time that now that you've seen them, you can see them. When you know they exist, you can see they're out there.
In a lot of ways, I think it is a matter of the fact that you're looking for them makes you a lot more likely to see them. Maybe there's more to it than that, but we really don't know. Between you and your uncle, who had a harder time dealing with that experience?
I honestly think I did. I was thinking about it after I talked to you the other day, and I had remembered him, and it didn't register with me at the time because I didn't know what he was talking about. But after recently finding out more about these sightings in Kentucky, he had actually said something. That's what happened at the LBL. I didn't know what the LBL was at the time, but now I know it's Land Between the Lakes area, and I guess there's been some pretty bad sights. So he must have known that these things were up there already, or something was up there already. But he seemed to deal with it. Unfortunately, he's passed away. He passed away several years ago. But I think that probably he dealt with it a lot better than I did. Of course, he was several years older than me, but he seemed to deal with it a lot better than I did. Like I said, we didn't talk about it a whole lot, but he didn't seem to lose any sleep over it. I certainly did. I don't know if he had nightmares. He never told me he did, but I know I did for a long time. So to be honest, I would have to say probably me. I had a much harder time dealing with it because it just wrecks your entire paradigm. Everything you believe that you've been taught, that you know from the time you're born till you have the experience, it's gone. Everything's completely changed, and you've got to completely change your mindset.
Yeah, it's funny how it has a tendency of doing that. Speaking of the sightings in Kentucky, did you know that they've also been seen in Florida?
Well, I do now. Though, honestly, I didn't know anything about there being dogmen in Florida. Now, I spent, like I said, my entire youth in the woods here in Florida. I've never seen anything like that here. I had several bobcat encounters and Florida panther encounters. Even saw a black panther in the wild, which is extremely rare. Lots of black bear, bobcats, stuff like that. But I've never, ever even seen a track from one of these things out there. So to find out they're here, that's even more reason for me to stay home.
Oh, I'd say it is. Before you saw that dogman, did you like to watch werewolf movies? And if so, did that change after you had that encounter?
I never watched them. I was never into the horror films and stuff like that before. I think actually I watched them more afterwards. I certainly did watch to see if I saw anything Hollywood was doing that was close to what I saw. And I did, in that movie Van Helsing, that one at the end, that big black one at the end was very close. If the body had been thicker on that one, the one I saw, it was very similar to that one from Van Helsing at the end, but it had a thicker body, just as muscular, but a lot thicker. The head was very similar to that one. Jody Cook has one of his books about werewolves, and there's a picture of a brown werewolf head on that book cover, and that is almost exactly the head of the one I saw, with the ears a little more pointed on the top, with little tufts of hair at the top like a bobcat. But this was very similar. But that one on Van Helsing at the end, the big black one, that was pretty close to the one I saw.
Yeah, that's not the kind of creature you want to run into in the woods, that's for sure. Well, Rick, it's about time for us to get out of here. Before we do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
Well, first off, I want to thank you for the show, Vic. It's a wonderful show, and it really is a lot of help in putting us in touch with one another, letting us know that we're not alone, that we don't have to go through this alone. And now I just want to let anybody out there that doubts these things are real. Believe me, they're real. And whatever you do, do not go looking for them, because you can't outmatch them. They're a formidable beast. They're obviously living, breathing flesh, and they have to eat. So if you do go looking for them, go with a group and be very careful. But thanks a lot, Vic. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks again for your time and coming on and telling us about that experience. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome, Vic.
Have a great night, okay?
You too, Vic. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll see ya.
Bye.
Bye. If you've had a Dogman encounter of your own and would like to speak with me, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you.